Chiputa and Asanda on Rise and Shine, weekdays 6 till 9 Central African Time on Channel Africa.
So, understandably, today, Zambians are in mourning of the passing of their sixth president, Edgar Lungu, who died in a Pretoria hospital at the age of 68, and he was undergoing medical treatment. We're not quite sure what he was ill with, but what I know for sure is that it wasn't the first time he'd been visited a hospital in South Africa. He had gone a few times before that, and we've reported on that several times. So perhaps this was something that he had been dealing with for a number of years now. He was the president of the country between 2015 and 2021, and that was a period of time that was marked by significant political and economic shifts. And after leaving office, he remained an active and often outspoken figure with the Patriotic Front, maintaining a visible presence in Zambian political discourse. President Hakainde Hichilema has called for unity during this period of national reflection. Well, to help us look back on Edgar Lungu's political legacy and his impact in Zambia's development, we're now joined by Zambian political analyst and historian, Dr. Euston Chiputa. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
I appreciate it.
I suppose legacy is going to be something that comes up quite a bit this week as people start to reflect on the life and times and contribution that former President, late President Edgar Lungu did for Zambia. What would you say from your viewpoint might be his legacy?
Well, I think President Lungu's legacy, one can say, could stem from the fact that initially he started off as someone who had not even an inkling of that he would be the next president after the death of President Michael Sata in 2014. But he was shoved into the fray and eventually became president, and therefore he took on the mantle of leadership. And from the word go, he said he would continue implementing the programs that Michael Sata had left. And I think, true to his word, a lot of the programs that were implemented under his rule, 7 years of being president of Zambia, President Edgar Lungu fulfilled many of those that had already started, and others that had been embryonic but were later, particularly in terms of infrastructure development. I think many people still remember President Lungu as having done a great deal in terms of decongesting Lusaka by building flyover bridges, but also in education, building schools, building hospitals, building clinics. And of course, when he left power, some of those were still being built, including the construction of extra hostel bed spaces in universities. So many of those remained incomplete, and they are still incomplete up to now. So the present government picked them up and is now trying to see that they can complete them.
But it came at a great cost, though, didn't it? I mean, debt soared, and some might even say because of the failure to pay repayments of international loans, that the country actually became somewhat bankrupt under his tenure. What does that tell us about the way he led? Maybe his heart was in the right place, but perhaps wasn't quite fully aware of the consequences of some of his actions.
Well, perhaps one would say to some extent they must have gotten carried away with particularly the loans that were coming from China, because a lot of the infrastructure projects were built using loans from China. But suffice to say that some of the money had already been borrowed from the Paris Club members by Michael Sata, believing that with the increasing copper production, increasing copper prices, Zambia would raise enough resources to be able to repay those loans. But that was not to be, because, as you have rightly said, indeed, in 2020, we were unable to continue repaying the loans and defaulted. And I think we were about the first country in Africa to default on those loans repayments, which the current government had a lot of challenges in renegotiating. So, yes, perhaps one would say people got carried away and thought that they could shine, they could make infrastructure projects, they could do all these other things on borrowed money without realizing that they needed a plan of how to repay those loans, which plan I think was not there.
When he eventually left office, I mean, he lost the election to Hakainde Hichilema by quite a huge margin, which was quite a statement by the Zambian public. What were they telling him in voting against him in such numbers?
Well, the 1 million plus votes that President Hakainde Hichilema got over former President Edgar Lungu was indeed a great stamp in endorsing HH as a particularly huge shift from the way Edgar Lungu had led Zambia. Though most Zambians were happy that some of that money literally was being spent on subsidizing the living conditions of the people, to the extent that people got used into thinking that life could be easy, and yet we were living on borrowed money and borrowed time. And so in the process, a lot of things went wrong. But also bear in mind the fact that one key area where President Lungu did not make a major mark was the kind of violence that was being perpetrated by the party youths in urban areas, in rural areas, in various parts of the country, which literally scared people, because some, it is said, were moving around with pangas, machetes, and threatening people at bus stations, in markets, extorting money, and doing many other things. And so that was a huge setback on the part of President Lungu. In spite of people telling the Patriotic Front then under President Lungu that was going to cost them the election, they thought they were loved by the people and they would win. And so surprisingly, they were shocked and they were evicted from power by the people.
As Hakainde Hichilema himself will testify, some would say that democracy took quite a knock, with opposition figures being arrested, restrictions on institutions such as the press. Why do you think he led with such a heavy hand towards the end?
You mean President Lungu?
Yes.
Well, you see, in African politics, usually our leaderships in many countries, no matter how democratic we are not, there's a very thin line between how we understand chieftainship and how we understand democratic governance. Oftentimes, when leaders are challenged on the democratic plane, they quickly switch to the authoritarian style of leadership that you see, or that you saw historically in chieftainships. So they revert to that as a means of wanting to push their agenda forward by shutting down the opposition. But in the process, it grows the animosity of the citizens, because they are made in crossfire and they are made to suffer. And so in the process, they wait for their time to vote. And in that case, they indeed waited for 12th August 2021, and they voted out the Patriotic Front and brought in the United Party for National Development of Hakainde Hichilema.
So perhaps as the day of his funeral comes closer and closer, how do you think Zambians will remember him?
Well, I think they will remember him on both planes, in terms of someone who tried his best to keep the cost of living quite low. Though the majority won't understand that that was done at great cost, because those were highly subsidized prices. But unfortunately, the subsidies were not made on Zambian money, but on borrowed money. So those who don't understand always talk about his cost of living having been lower than the current cost of living in Zambia, because they don't appreciate that that was being done on borrowed money. Others remember him, of course, on the various infrastructure projects that were implemented, and because of that, many have nostalgic remembrance of President Lungu, and so in the process we have mixed feelings. Those who remember him as having been someone who did a lot for the country, and those who remember him as having unleashed some form of terror, particularly through the party youths called the cadres, and so it's a mixed grill.
All right, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. But thank you so much indeed for sharing your thoughts on how people might remember former President Edgar Lungu.
I appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you. That's Dr. Euston Chiputa, Zambian political analyst and historian, helping us unpack the legacy of Edgar Lungu, which appears quite mixed.
Wake up!